You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Professor Richard Carwardine. Is that correct?
I say Carwardine, but I certainly respond to Carwardine. Not a problem.
Well, maybe it's the influence of living here in the colonies. He is the Emeritus Rhodes Professor of American History and Distinguished Fellow of the Rothamir Institute at Oxford University. And he's so kind to come on the Leaders and Legend podcast via Zoom to discuss his book, which took me in directions, quite frankly, about the Civil War, the American Civil War. I guess since you're a Brit, we have to be careful and specific.
Yeah.
It took me in directions that I really hadn't thought of, and it's a remarkable effort. The book is Righteous Strife: How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. Professor Carwardine, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, for inviting me.
Well, we don't have that many discussions about Lincoln and the American Civil War that feature a British accent. So I feel like we're getting the best of both worlds here. How long have you been a scholar of our war between the states and of our 16th president?
Since a scholar, I suppose, since about 1994, maybe about 30 years, I started work on a short biography of Lincoln at the request of the publisher, the British publisher Longmans, who then was subsumed by Pearson, for a series called Profiles in Power. And they wanted a short 80,000-word essay on Abraham Lincoln. And your listeners may be well aware that during the 1970s and 1980s, very little was written about Lincoln. And as a teacher of American history, I longed for something that would supplement Richard Current's Lincoln Nobody Knows, Benjamin Thomas's excellent biography of Lincoln, but something that would be short, crisp, and analytical. Well, as I say, I started work on it in 1994. Longman was taken over by Pearson, and the editor at Pearson said, well, we want something, I think we need something more than just a kind of analytical essay on Lincoln. We really want something more like a biography. So I said, well, okay, if you give me some more words, I'll turn in something that is it'll be a political study. It won't be a full, deeping down into the weeds kind of biography, but it will be an attempt to analyze the sources of Lincoln's power and how he deployed it. And to my extraordinary good luck, the book went on to win the Lincoln Prize, which I don't think I knew about the Lincoln Prize when I was writing the book. So that's what turned me into a Lincolnian. And once you become a Lincolnian, well, two things happen, I think, when you're writing a biography. One is you fall out of love with your subject.
Sure.
The other is that actually you fall rather more deeply in love with your subject than you ever intended. And as a Brit, I didn't grow up as many Americans do. I know not all Americans, but many Americans do grow up having to cope with the mythology of Lincoln when they come to analyze him. I didn't have to worry about that kind of mythology, but I did discover very quickly that despite my attempt to remain clear-eyed, and I think I do remain clear-eyed, nonetheless, Lincoln does grow on one for I think the extraordinary range both of skills and qualities that make him unique amongst American presidents.
I was going to ask you this question at the end, and we're definitely going to get into your book, but a couple of things. What did you think of the movie Lincoln and the fact that Daniel Day-Lewis, of all people, portrays our rail splitter?
I thought very highly of the movie. It's a movie, so you don't look for complete accuracy, but I think it's authentic in its portrayal of Lincoln. What we see of Lincoln there is a man who is using all his political skills, using the political system to achieve noble ends. And I think that's how he regarded politics. He knew you got your hands dirty at times in politics, and you certainly couldn't always speak everything that you had on your mind. I think Lincoln was honest, but there's a different kind of honesty. There's an honesty where you tell everything, and there's an honesty where you tell something. Lincoln was very good about telling something, but not always everything. So he knew the limitations, the kind of ethical and moral limitations of the political universe, but also the moral and ethical potential of the political universe. And I think the movie got that across extremely well. I know if you'd had absolutely accurate congressional debates, it would have been tedious beyond belief.
Yeah.
And there were some of my friends who were not historians who said that they thought the movie was like a class of history on a wet Wednesday afternoon.
Oh, it was obviously
but
very well received here. Yeah, it was very well received here in the United States. Forgive me, and and Lewis received the Oscar, thank God, because he just certainly deserved it.
Yeah.
So why does someone from Oxford, from Britain, with all of the British, English, British, Anglo-Saxon history, how do you gravitate to the American Civil War, to this period, to this president as a scholar when there's so much? I've been to England about 10 times, can't get there enough. What made you matriculate over to our side?
Well, there's a simple answer. It's not a very exciting one, but I took a course in Oxford as an undergraduate back in the 1960s. And it was a course that had been devised by the great American Civil War historian Allan Nevins.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Nevins is known to many of us, but been forgotten, not known to perhaps to all of the younger generation. There was a time when his books on the American Civil War, not just on the Civil War, but particularly on the American Civil War, were the standard fare. Nevins was the visiting Harmsworth professor in Oxford and devised a course which ran for decades called Slavery and Secession. And it was based on something like 2,000 pages of documentation, congressional, political sources, but in particular, the works of Lincoln and the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And that year, when I was taking it, the visiting Harmsworth professor himself was Don Fehrenbacher. Prelude to Greatness, I found utterly compelling. And that made me an American historian. I was quite clear that if I was going to be a historian, I would be an American historian. I did a graduate degree at Oxford, which included a 1-year study at Berkeley. I found myself moving into religious history largely because my graduate advisor, gave me a steer when I was saying, I really want to understand more about the American anti-slavery mentality. The more I read, the more I realized I needed to know about American religion. And he was not an American historian himself, though he was certainly he was interested in America. Spent some time at Brown University and University of South Carolina, and knew the American religious historiography and Bill McLaughlin in particular. And that got me into American religion. So when I got my first job at Sheffield University in the 1970s, and the job was to teach American history from the Revolution to Reconstruction. There was no doubt that the American Civil War and Lincoln's role in politics before and during the war was going to be absolutely central to that. So that's how it happened. You're quite right. I could have become a British historian. But frankly, in Oxford, by my final year, I wanted to do something else. And because I don't have good languages, my Latin is not very good and my French is barely better, I thought I needed to do a subject whose sources were in the English language or something approximating the English language.
I feel your pain on that. That is, as much as I would love to do a PhD in European history, and I still may as my retirement present to myself, it is the lack of acumen when it comes to languages that may hold me back. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We are speaking with Professor Richard Carwardine, which rhymes with strychnine, which I should have known because I watch Perot all the time. We're discussing his book, Righteous Strife, How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. I want to start with Lincoln himself. You know, Lincoln tends to belong to everybody, which means everybody fights over him. Republicans like me, you know, he's the standard bearer, the founder of our party, so on, greatest president ever. You know, people who may not be Republicans like me, you know, Lincoln would never have been a Republican today. Frederick Douglass famously, you know, sort of viewed Lincoln with disdain, then fell in love. The list goes on and on. But one of the aspects of Lincoln's existence, of his philosophy that gets the most debate, in my view, is his view on God and religion. I know it would be a whole nother podcast to talk just about that, but where do you fit Lincoln in the sort of, you know, he's not this, he's not that, but he's a believer?
I think the important starting point is to recognize that over his lifetime, Lincoln moved through his own personal inquiry and intellectual interests from being a pretty dismissive about conventional Christianity to a president who had more time for believers and Orthodox believers. If you want me to give a simple answer to where he ended up, I would say that Lincoln did not end up as a Trinitarian Christian. He did not end up as the evangelical Protestant that evangelical Protestants wanted him to be, but he'd got a lot closer to the concept of a God of history who intervened in human affairs, to a understanding of an Almighty whose role in the world was palpable. He'd come a huge way from where he was as a young man in New Salem, where, having freed himself from the hyper-Calvinism, the strict Calvinism of his parents, his Baptist parents, where he, according to some, was pretty close to an atheist, might even have written a little text, a little tract on infidelity and showing the Bible to be a work of, if not fiction, at least of an unreliable source. He then moves to Springfield, where he meets for the first time intelligent or educated clergy, and not simply the frontier revivalists who had crossed his path while he was at New Salem and beforehand as a boy. And in his conversations with fellow believers, or I don't say fellow believers, but fellow churchgoers in Springfield, because his wife Mary was a member of the First Presbyterian Church in Springfield. He joined her. They rented a pew, but he was not a church member as she was. He had no profession of faith, but he wasn't a regular attender, but he did discuss faith with Billy Herndon, his law partner. His law partner, Herndon, introduced him to William Ellery Channing and Theodore Parker, these Boston Unitarians. And their liberalism and rationality was in some ways sort of related to the rationality of Tom Paine, the deist that Lincoln had really warmed to during the 1830s when he was a young man. So there's sort of rationality that Lincoln brings to his questions of faith. And one of his lawyer colleagues said that Lincoln really was, Jesse Fell of Bloomington, said his view of faith could be summed up in two propositions: the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. So that's Lincoln, as it were, before the war. But something happens. Something happens in wartime. I describe it in my book as Lincoln's providentialist term. The idea that there is an active providence at work in human affairs. He doesn't become a fully fledged Trinitarian Christian, but he now regularly attends the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, an old school Presbyterian church. The trauma of war, I think, gives him a new perception of God. I don't think he's in any way driven by guilt. You might think that, the responsibility for the war, he would feel very heavily, and I think he did feel the responsibility very heavily. Certainly the human grief and suffering, including, of course, the loss of his own son, Willie. He comes to see God, I think, during the war as a much more unfathomable and more mysterious figure than the rational God of Tom Paine or the Unitarians. This is a God who is in some ways quixotic, is some way has his own purposes. And of course, the fully fledged statement of that position is in the second inaugural. Would you like me to continue just to say?
Well, I was going to ask you about, we definitely want to get to the second inaugural, because when I read Edward Acorn's book, which I think it's Every Drop of Blood, and I'm feeling better about my book choices on the Civil War, because your background is nothing but Civil War books, and I recognize about half of them. So I feel like I'm at least reading the same books as a scholar. In Acorn's book on the second inaugural is really impactful for me. But I want to ask you about your subtitle here: How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. And by warring, I didn't get the impression you meant the military battlefield.
No, that's quite right. There's a huge contest between two different kinds of nationalists during the religious nationalists during the Civil War. And the background to this, I should say, is the sort of the geopolitical background to the Civil War. I think had been fashioned over decades. Of course, it's based around slavery, but it's also based around the ethics of slavery and the morality of slavery and the theology of slavery and the position of slavery in the moral universe of the nation in the decades leading up to the war. Broadly speaking, there are two strands of religious thinking in the period leading up to the war, and they've been there for decades. And they reached their culmination in 1860 in the showdown, the electoral showdown of Lincoln's election. On the one hand, you have anti-slavery religious nationalists, those who believe that slavery is a scar upon the nation. It's not just a secular scar, it's a scar of a moral kind. And they base their arguments, whether it's the Liberty Party or the Free Soil Party or then the Republican Party, they base their arguments in considerable part on the irreligious nature of slavery as it is practiced, and arguing that both the Constitution and the justice of God point in the direction of a slave-free nation. On the other hand, at the same time, you have a set of religious nationalists who resist what they see as the Puritanism of New England. They see this Republican Party that is proclaiming a certain kind of Puritan gospel, meddling in the affairs of other people, as being dictatorial, as being despotic, as wanting to lead other people's lives for them. The seeds of this are to be found in the spread of the population over the Appalachians into the South and the West in the period up to 18 and after 1820, when they're followed by, or they're accompanied by, preachers who resist the ministry of the Yankee educated Presbyterians and Congregationalists. These are plain people who respond to the plain gospel, are preachers who emphasize above all individual piety above social reform. They see the American Anti-Slavery Society, the American Bible Society, the American Temperance Society, the American Sunday School Union. They see this as priestcraft. They see this as money-making religion, and they want nothing to do with it. So there is this profound cultural conflict between what I call anti-slavery nationalism and a conservative nationalism, a pietistic nationalism. And that comes to a head in 1860. What happens after the secession of the South is that these two elements, this anti-slavery nationalism and this conservative nationalism, combine after Fort Sumter into almost a single stream of nationalist ambition. Reconstitute the Union, take down the South, take down the secessionist leaders of the South, rebuild the nation. But very quickly, the pre-Civil War contest between anti-slavery nationalists and conservative nationalists reemerges. It reemerges as soon as the anti-slavery forces in the Union start calling on Lincoln to press the button for emancipation, to introduce measures that will bring about the end of slavery, because this is what the Almighty wants. At the same time, in response, the conservative nationalists say, no, what we want is the Union as it was. It's a union based on individualism, on masculinity, on the family, on states' rights, on localism. And so you have these two competing religious nationalists at work through the war. They don't remain absolutely stable and unchanging. A number of conservatives move into the emancipationist nationalist position because they come to see the pragmatism of it. But many others remain absolutely convinced that the only way that you can reconstitute the Union is by basing it on the Constitution as it was, on the Union as it was before the war.
It's been millennia in the use of the Lord, whose ever God it is, to inspire troops, to justify causes, whether it's the Battle of Tours, and that's the Franks against the Muslims, 732 in France, or the Crusades, or the Siege of Constantinople, one of the many. The list goes on and on. God is on our side. This is what God wants. God wants us to win. How did the warring nationalists, each of the two clans that you mentioned, how did they use God's word to justify their point of view?
Well, that's a very, very big question. I mean, and an interesting one, of course. I'd say, I would want to distinguish between the army and the secular and the home front. I think as far as the armies are concerned, the idea that the Union cause is a cause justified by God is widespread right across the serving ranks, whether they're Democrats or whether they're Republicans. There are, of course, anti-slavery chaplains who preach an anti-slavery gospel, but mostly the serving troops they pray. They certainly pray before battle. They believe in an overriding providence, and they fight alongside Democrats and Republicans, fight alongside one another. As your listeners will know, the army begins with a very strong attachment to McClellan. The Democratic Party is well represented in the serving forces, soldiers and sailors. By the end of the war, however, the majority of the troops are Republican and Union Party supporters. Nonetheless, it's not, partisanship is not an issue, a profound issue in the fighting forces. But on the domestic front, on the home front, the political world is riven between these two forces. And do you want to say something?
No, sir, you go right ahead.
No. It's relevant. And my book is really a book about the multiplicity of voices. There are many, many voices in my book. I use both religious newspapers and sermons, as well as secular newspapers and secular sources to show this complete interpenetration of religion and politics. Those many, many voices can be, I try to categorize, try to demonstrate, I try to bring some kind of sense to anyone who works on the Civil War will encounter religion. It's just there wherever you turn. And what my book is intended to do is to bring some kind of sense to that, to maybe not to recognize there's lots of sort of raw and sort of frayed edges and so forth. You can't package it all neatly. But I see two very broad positions when it comes to the politics of the war in the Union. On the one hand, as I say, the preachers and the editors who use the scriptures to demonstrate that, and in particular, they draw on Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, as well as on the Gospels, to show that the Union has a covenant with God. It's a covenant theology, and that the Union has an ethical responsibility. It has a character, a moral character. That moral character must be sustained if the American nation is to be true to its founding, and if it's to be true to its role as a new Israel, as a latter-day Israel. So on that side, I think the covenantal theological side, you get preachers talking about the responsibility of the nation to shed its slavery, to shed itself of the profound scar, this cancer of slavery, this moral scourge of the nation. At the same time, you have preachers, Catholic and a minority of Protestants, who are utterly bewildered by what they see as this extraordinary, in their own terms, extraordinary betrayal of true scripture. The scriptures, nowhere do the scriptures denounce slavery. The patriarchs held slaves. The Old Testament is full of slaveholders. Nowhere does Christ denounce slavery in the Roman Empire. Paul urges the return of runaway slaves to their masters. Slavery is not a sin against God. Slavery is part of the biblical and scriptural. So they see the higher law, as they put it, of the abolitionists and the anti-slavery acts. They see this as a betrayal. This is unscriptural. This is blasphemy. It's a betrayal of the theological truth. And my book is an attempt to show how, on the democratic side, there is as much a commitment to an ethic of republicanism, albeit a racially hierarchical republicanism, a white supremacist republicanism, but they see that white supremacist republicanism as being more than just a kind of racial supremacy, but actually as being true to the ethos and to the letter of Scripture.
In your book, you discuss many different denominations and how they viewed slavery, viewed the conduct of the war, on and on. I'm going to be a complete homer, and as a Catholic, ask you, how do you? First question I want to ask is how did Catholicism deal with these thorny issues, especially when it came to urban Catholicism and employment?
Yeah.
That's the first question.
That's a very good question. And of course, there isn't an absolutely unified Catholic position. American Catholicism is pluralistic, demographically pluralistic, but the predominant element, as you well know, in Catholicism at this time is Irish. And these are poor Americans. These are working class Americans. who are in direct competition in the Free States with free blacks in many urban settings, and there's no love lost between them. And the Catholic hierarchy recognized this. They recognized the concept of emancipation is anathema to many of these working class Irish, and they also recognized that therefore a war that becomes a war for emancipation after January 1863 is not a war in which working class Irish necessarily want to participate. And so you have these conscription riots, bloody conscription riots in New York City, which sees the death of innumerable blacks in the black communities of New York. So that's one dimension of Catholicism as it's expressed in terms of the sort of social action. But at the same time, there are anti-slavery Catholics. These are a minority of the Catholic hierarchy. But the Purcell brothers, Edward and John Purcell, out there in Cincinnati, the Catholic Telegraph is their newspaper, and Archbishop Purcell is a stalwart for emancipation. But the majority, it has to be said, the majority of the Catholic hierarchy, North and South, are politically very, very conservative. Right. The papacy in this period is not the papacy of the 21st century. And the Catholics of the mid-19th century are politically much more conservative than they evidently are in the 20th and 21st century. There's a period, as it were, in which the politics of Catholics in these 1850s are profoundly reactionary in some instances. And the spokespersons for these conservative Catholics include Copperheads, the Copperhead editors, John Mullally in the Metropolitan Record, and above all, James McMaster in the New York Freeman's Journal. And these are peace Democrats to the core. They can't see any chance of the Union winning the war. It's carnage for the sake of this idea, which is, it's an unrealistic idea that you can bring about that emancipation is consistent with reunion. You also, of course, have war Democrat Catholics, the Boston Pilot, John Donahue, the Boston Pilot. He's not a Copperhead. He believes in the war, but he believes in a war that is going to restore the Union as it was, which is a union with slavery under the old Constitution, and where the racial hierarchy that existed before 1860 persists in the post-war period.
Isn't the phrase, I was going to say the motto, that's not the right term, the phrase, the nation the Constitution as it is, the nation as it was, or something like that? Is that
that's right? The Constitution, the Constitution as it is, the nation as it was. Yes, that'll do. Yeah.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise and federally certified veteran-owned business. Our guest today is Professor Richard Carwardine. He is coming to us from England, from, I guess, Great Britain England, right? You're actually in England.
That's right. Yes.
It's where my family's from. It's from Durham. Raby Castle is still owned by the Vane family.
Well,
we are. Yeah. I know. I wish I was at the castle doing this podcast with you, but we're discussing his book, Righteous Strife: How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. We could spend the entire podcast running through the denominations and how you dissected brilliantly their views, and the fact that each denomination had within it multiple views. But I started off with Catholicism, but we have to mention the Methodists. The Methodist religion denomination really took off in the antebellum period. I think in your book, it's the largest one, or at least maybe the most powerful, and as we head into 1860s and into the war.
Yes, the largest.
Much like the modern day internal conflict over transgender and homosexual rights that is really hitting denominations, I can say, here in the United States, causing schisms between Presbyterians and others, Methodists. What did slavery, or how did slavery both unite the Methodists and pull them apart?
Well, it's true that the question of slavery and slaveholding within the churches was a vexed one, and by 1850, the three major churches, Protestant churches, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and the largest of all, the Methodists, had split on the question of slavery. And the most meaningful of those, the most consequential of those, was the split in the Methodist Church in the mid-1840s. This did not mean, however, that the Methodist Church had ceased to split into northern and southern branches. It didn't mean that northern Methodists had no slaveholders, but it did mean that it did mean that bishops could not be slaveholders. So there were, but the whole question as to the morality of slavery and the legitimacy of slavery is extremely vexed. And as you rightly say, these are issues as today which can really carve denominations and churches in twain. They can split them down the middle. And that's really what happened in the antebellum and Civil War period. And my book is really an attempt to show that it's not helpful to investigate, not ultimately helpful to investigate the religion of the war by looking at denominations by denomination, but to look at the ways in which ideas cut across and through denominations, so that there are, for example, Methodism was described by Ulysses Grant as loyalism. Methodism is loyalism, but not all Methodists were in fact Republicans or Union Party members. Many were Democrats, and a number of them were Copperheads. Likewise, Baptists, a majority of Baptists were in the North were for the war, and possibly a majority of those were Republicans. But there were also Copperhead Baptists, and there were Copperhead Catholics, just as there were Republican and pro-war Catholics. So the denominational labels, they are important, but they're not as important as looking at what unites and divides those individual denominations and pulls people into Republican Party and Democratic Party loyalists, and means that the 1862 and the 1862 congressional elections and state elections, and the 1864 presidential election, and of course congressional elections again, are to be understood, and this is what I argue in the book, are to be understood only if you understand that the geopolitics of the time are as much religious as they are secular, that there's this complete interpenetration of religion and politics, that religion is not a kind of add-on to the story of the Civil War, that it's actually, the war is a religious war, that the mental makeup of three-quarters of Americans, at least, in the antebellum period in 1860 is fashioned. The three-quarters are fashioned in part by religion. Three-quarters of the white Americans are in the orbit of the churches, Catholic and Protestant, and something like 50% of Americans are Protestants, are evangelicals, are in the orbit of evangelical churches. So this is a very powerful cultural influence. And it shapes the way that men and women think about what was, after all, an existential crisis. The Civil War was about the future of the country. And when existence is at stake, you're dealing not just with questions of political policy, but you're dealing with questions of ultimate meaning, of ethical meaning, moral meaning, and in a godly country, what it is that God wants from you, particularly in a country which has understood itself, thanks to the American Revolution, to be a nation under God.
The last best hope of earth.
Yes. Yeah.
This book is obviously not the culmination, but because hopefully for all of us, you'll write more books, but certainly not the first time you have delved into the interconnection of religion and politics and society as it relates to antebellum United States and the war. That's the foundation of a question I want to ask you about surprise. Even though you've been doing this for decades, are you surprised at all, or maybe a different verb, that religion was used so fervently and assiduously to buttress not only slavery, but the slave power?
I suppose I'm not surprised. I come from Wales.
So you have a statue of Edward the First there, someone you're on.
Yeah, that's right. And I grew up in South Wales, where the intersection of Liberal Party and nonconformist religion gave rise to what was called the nonconformist conscience. And of course, one of the heroes of nonconformity was David Lloyd George, the great prime minister during the Great War. So I grew up in a society where the chapel culture, the culture of non-Anglican religion and radical politics, socialist politics, liberal politics, where religion and politics were mutually intertwined. And I think that possibly has some explanation as to how it is that I sort of come to investigate this intersection of the secular and the religious in the United States. So I'm not surprised at the capacity of religious faith to animate societies and to create a situation where, on the one hand, Alexander Stevens can say in his cornerstone speech that the South has put in place through the Confederacy has put in place a republic founded on a truth that no previous society has been based on, which is the inferiority of the African race and the superiority of the white race, but which is also vindicated by biblicism and by scripture. It doesn't surprise me that the slave power could do that. Of course, Lincoln's riposte to all of that was, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Because if you remember, that's his wonderful riposte to Frederick Ross, who had written the book on the pro-slavery vindication, the theological vindication of the Southern way of life. And Lincoln said, well, it's all very well for Dr. Ross to say that slavery is justified by scripture, because Dr. Ross is the person who's going to decide the question as to whether he, Dr. Ross, sits in the shade with gloves on his hands while Sambo, his slave Sambo, is delving in the burning sun, is working in the burning sun. Dr. Ross will have to, if Dr. Ross decides that slavery is not justified, then he has to throw off his gloves and has to go and work in the burning sun himself. And therefore, he says, it's a lovely sentence, when I've committed it to memory, will Dr. Ross be actuated by that perfect impartiality which has ever been considered most favorable to correct decisions? The answer is no, he won't. But in fairness to Lincoln doesn't adopt that tone in his second inaugural. He's come by the second inaugural to recognize that his God is actually unfathomable. That God may not have been on the side of either the North or the South. That actually, it's a national sin, that this is an expiation of a national sin. And of course, there's a political purpose in the second inaugural, which is to prepare the way for a peace which will help to heal the terrible rift. But there's also, I think, a theological statement here. Lincoln said to Thurlow Weed in a letter which Weed has said after the second inaugural that he'd written to Lincoln, and Lincoln, I think, misread Weed's letter. Weed had said that Lincoln thought that Weed had said that the second inaugural was a terrific, a terrific speech. And Lincoln said, "Well, he thinks the speech will wear well, perhaps better," he said, "than anything that I've produced, but I don't believe it's immediately popular." And of course, because he said, men are not flattered, he said, by being shown that there's been a difference of purpose between them and the Almighty. But then he goes on and says, and seems to me, this is a private letter after all, to deny it, however, is to deny that there is a God governing the world. Now, that's not a statement that Lincoln could make as forcefully in 1830 or 1840 or 1850. And then he goes on to say he thought the truth needed to be told because whatever humiliation there is in it, it falls directly on myself. And so I thought this would allow me to tell it. So Lincoln, too, having previously berated Dr. Ross on the question of the pro-slavery theology, has come to accept that Northern theology, too, may have its shortcomings. He doesn't, I think, believe slavery to have been right. Of course, the second inaugural is an offence, and this is the offence whose time under the providence of God has now come to an end, and the war is the means of exorcising it from the nation, and excising it from the nation.
And the casualties, the death, the hurt, the pain is the price being paid for our sin. May I ask you, as your capacity as a writer and a Lincoln scholar, is Lincoln's second inaugural address your favorite speech of his?
Yes. There are two speeches that I esteem more than, well, one is a speech, the second inaugural. The other is the speech that he would have given had he gone to Springfield, Illinois in September of 1863, when he was invited by James Conkling to go and canvass for the election there, the state election there. Lincoln, of course, didn't go, but he sent a letter which he urged Conkling to read in a particular way. He said, read it slowly. He was, I think the Conkling letter therefore, I think we can call it a speech, is also a remarkable speech. It's one in which Lincoln sets out his thoughts about the bravery and the bravery of the black troops who are fighting for the freedom of the white men who are unpersuaded by emancipation and by the enlistment of blacks in the federal armies. It's a wonderful speech. It's a speech that there are many occasions where you wish Lincoln would have not said what he did say about racial issues in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, maybe in respect to his statement to the blacks who came to visit him in the White House, right, August of 1862. But this speech, the Conkling speech, is, it seems to me, a work of great humanity. And likewise, the second inaugural is both a sort of intellectual tour de force and an aesthetic tour de force. It's stylistically brilliant. And it is the most surprising of all of Lincoln's speeches. Who would have expected a second inaugural to have really been a sermon in which Lincoln really, it's providentialist. He's attempting to apprehend God's purposes. He speaks of a God who's intervening in human affairs, a God of judgment. It's a recognition of the need for national punishment. I think he alludes to God 14 times in it. He has 4 passages of scripture, directly or indirectly. It is not what people were expecting when the war was manifestly coming to an end. And here is a speech which is soul searching. It is nationally soul searching. And I fancy that when visitors go to the Lincoln Memorial, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but when visitors go to the memorial, and they see those two speeches there, the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural. The Gettysburg Address is immediately familiar. Those 272 words are sort of chiseled into the brains of so many people who go to to see them. The second inaugural, 600, 700 words, probably less familiar to visitors. But in their way, those words are, I think, more profound than perhaps less obviously eloquent than the Gettysburg Address, but I think more profound, and probably the most profound theological statement of the Civil War.
The Civil War, the American Civil War, is certainly quotable and full of quotes. And something you mentioned a few minutes ago reminded me of one of my 3 or 4 favorite quotes, and it's by a Georgian named Howell Cobb, who said, if the slaves will make good soldiers, then our entire theory of slavery is wrong.
Yes.
How did, and it obviously he was wrong all the way around, but how did the actual fighting prowess, the courage, the enthusiasm, even in the face not only of combat, not only of discrimination, but of the South's determination to exact revenge on Black Americans wearing the uniform and carrying a gun, how did their performance, these Black soldiers, how did it change, if it did, the outlook, the opinion of who they were as a race?
Yeah. It undoubtedly did make a difference. It's hard to quantify, but it's not difficult to find many, many examples of those both at the front and indeed on the home front who were persuaded by Lincoln himself, I think. Let us, one of those, he was not certain that giving the guns to the Black troops would mean that they that they would acquit themselves well. Indeed, the guns might easily fall into the hands of the enemy, he said to the Chicago Christians who went to meet him. So it did change opinions on the home front and in the armies themselves. I think whether it changed as many opinions as the first-hand acquaintance with slavery did for the white troops, the white Union troops, I'm not sure, actually. I think what we can be clear is that what is clear is that for many whites who had gone to the South with one idea of the nation that they were defending came to see that the nation they thought they were defending was not worth defending. Actually, they don't want to see a continuation of slavery. They are shocked by what they see of slavery at first hand. So it's a combination of shock at slavery at first hand and admiration for what the Black troops, some of whom, of course, are previously slaves, what they would do. So it's a combination of those two elements, I think, yeah.
Much like Lincoln was shocked when he went down the riverboat. You mentioned down the Mississippi. You mentioned New Salem. I should say that's New Salem, Indiana.
Yes.
This podcast originates from Indianapolis, Indiana. So there's always the tug of war among Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois as to which one influenced Lincoln the most. Last question, and before we get to the 5 questions I ask all of our guests, and this is a big one, or could be an expansive answer, so don't feel like you have to give one, and that is, there remains a debate, not necessarily among scholars, but among students of the Civil War, as to the relationship between slavery and the causes of the Civil War. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being I'm a complete and total scholar, 1 being I'm a complete and total idiot, if I made the statement, the assertion that, quote, slavery did not cause the Civil War, close quote, what would you think of me?
I think 1.
I was expecting something lower, so I guess 1 is there's something about the refusal to acknowledge, and I've had a few of these discussions with folks, and my response always is, tell me a compromise that happened in the 19th century before the Civil War that wasn't about slavery. Because every single compromise, Missouri or The list goes on and on. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. They all had the foundation of slavery. The country, in many ways, was described geographically as it relates to slavery. You know, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio used to be the West. Then they became the North. That is solely related to the existence of slavery. So anyway, if I assert that, which I'm not, but still I'm a 1. How do you, as a scholar, and maybe as an Englishman, how do you tackle that question, that the assertion that slavery was not the main cause of the war?
Well, I'd say my answer to that is that there would have been no war had there been no slavery.
I think you should just stop right there. Can't beat it. We have reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests, not just our Lincoln scholars. Professor Carwardine, are you ready?
I am ready. Yes, as ready as I can be.
What was your first job?
My first job, when I was 10 years old, I acted when the builders came to my house in South Wales. I swept up after them every day, and I didn't know it, but at the end of the week, they gave me a wages packet, 10 shillings. I didn't know it was a job at the time, but that's what it was. But my first actual employment was at the University of Sheffield in 1971.
What was your first concert?
First concert?
First music concert, yes.
It was singing in the Brahms Requiem in St. Mary's Church in Monmouth, the Monmouth Boys' School Choir in 1958.
Pretty good. If you could, I don't know if you know Helen Rappaport.
And by name.
Yeah, she came on the podcast to discuss her book on the last days of the Romanovs.
Yeah.
And her first concert was, she saw the Beatles in a pub in 1961.
Oh, I see. So my first concert, if you've seen that, I thought it was the one where I actually performed in, because I was in the choir, you see, of the frog. But anyway, yes, okay.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Middlemarch by George Eliot.
That you mentioned.
You mean a history book or just any
Benjamin? Sure, any book. I love that you mentioned Benjamin Thomas's biography of Lincoln came out in the 1950s here, and it's my favorite Civil War book.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you want my favorite Civil War book, that's a difficult one. I think I'd go with Prelude to Greatness, Don Fehrenbacher's Prelude to Greatness, simply because it was the first book on American politics that I read. I read 2 books in preparation for my Alan Nevin's course. One was Ken Stamp, The Peculiar Institution, and the second was Don Fehrenbacher, Prelude to Greatness. It's not, of course, Fehrenbacher's The Impending Crisis would be another one.
Sure, yeah, that's right. And I don't know if I should say this as a confession or a proclamation, but I've actually read all of Nevin's books. I think there's 10, 12, that whole ordeal for the Union and all that. Was superb. A Stillness at Appomattox, Bruce Catton's book.
Yes.
Number 4, maybe this is even tougher. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose? Does not have to be American Civil War.
No.
Any event in history.
I would like to have been at the September cabinet meeting when Lincoln introduced it with the reading from Artemus Ward, and then followed it up with a statement that he was going to issue his Emancipation Proclamation.
The last shriek, as Seward called it.
Yeah. Yes.
Number 5. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Oh, wow. Michelle Obama.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise and federally certified veteran-owned business. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We enjoyed your book and enjoyed the discussion.
Good. Well, thank you. I often get myself. Anyway, yeah. I hope it. I hope you. I'd be interested to see what kind of feedback you get on that. Anyway, but nice talking to you, Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.